The bus terminal was alive with noise and movement that morning. People dragged heavy suitcases across the floor, wheels rattling on the tiles. Families called out to each other, worried about missing their ride. Vendors shouted about hot coffee and fresh snacks, hoping to sell to sleepy travelers. In the middle of this busy place walked Officer Daniel, dressed neatly in his uniform. At his side moved his trusted partner, a large German shepherd named Rex. The dog's eyes were sharp, his ears alert, and his nose twitched at every scent. Together they were a familiar sight at the terminal. Many people felt safer just seeing them there. Daniel had been working with Rex for years. He trusted the dog's instincts more than he trusted his own eyes sometimes. Rex had a way of noticing things that others missed. If there was danger, Rex would be the first to sense it. That morning, Daniel thought it would be an ordinary day. He walked slowly through the waiting area, nodding at a few regular travelers and checking for anything unusual. Rex walked proudly, his paws making soft sounds on the ground, his tail steady behind him. Nothing seemed out of place, at least at first. As they moved through the rows of benches, Daniel's attention was caught by a figure sitting slumped on one of the seats. A man dressed in dark clothes had leaned back with his head resting on a small bag. His mouth was slightly open, and it looked like he was sleeping deeply. It wasn't unusual. After all, people often rested while waiting for long trips. Still, Daniel slowed down. Something about the man didn't feel right, though he couldn't explain why. Before he could think about it further, Rex stopped walking. The German shepherd's body stiffened. His ears shot up and his eyes locked on the sleeping passenger. Then, without warning, Rex let out a sharp bark. The sound was so loud and sudden that several people nearby jumped. A woman carrying a baby looked over in surprise. A group of teenagers waiting for their bus laughed nervously and whispered among themselves. But Rex did not stop. He barked again and again, pulling gently on his leash as if trying to get closer to the man. His growls came low and steady, his body tense. Daniel frowned. Rex was a disciplined dog. He didn't bark without a reason. Usually, if Rex barked, there was trouble. Sometimes drugs, sometimes a suspicious package, sometimes a person behaving strangely. Daniel gently tugged the leash, giving a quiet command to calm down. "Easy, boy," he whispered. But Rex didn't listen. His barking only grew louder, echoing across the terminal. More people turned to look, whispering and pointing. Some passengers grew nervous. Dogs like Rex were trained to detect serious threats. What had he found this time? Daniel took a step closer to the sleeping man. He studied him carefully. The man didn't move at all, not even when Rex barked right at him. Normally, even a heavy sleeper would shift or frown at such noise. But this man stayed completely still, his chest rising and falling so slowly that it was hard to notice at first. Daniel's instincts began to match Rex's unease. Something was definitely strange. The officer crouched slightly and watched the man's face. There was sweat on his forehead, though the terminal wasn't hot. His skin looked pale under the dim lights. Daniel's experience told him this wasn't just a tired passenger. Still, he wanted to be careful. He didn't want to cause unnecessary panic. He glanced around. A few security staff had already noticed the scene and were walking over. Travelers were pulling out phones, recording or taking pictures. Everyone's attention was now on this one man and the barking dog that refused to stay quiet. "Sir," Daniel said loudly, trying to wake the passenger. He reached out and gave the man's shoulder a light shake. No reaction. The man's head only rolled slightly to the side. Rex barked again, pawing at the ground, restless. Daniel called out once more, this time with more force. Still no response. The tension in the terminal rose. Some people started backing away from the bench, worried about what might be happening. Daniel's heart began to beat faster. He trusted Rex's nose. If the dog was acting like this, there had to be a reason. He studied the bag on which the man was resting his head. It was small, black, and tightly zipped. Rex's nose kept pointing toward it, his barking never leaving the target. The officer felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be drugs? Could it be something worse? He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but Rex had never been wrong before. By now, 2 more officers had arrived. One of them asked Daniel what was going on. Daniel explained quickly, keeping his eyes on the man. "He's not waking up. Rex is insisting on the bag. Something's wrong." The other officers nodded and stepped back, keeping the crowd from getting too close. Some passengers muttered nervously, asking each other if there was a bomb. Others whispered about drugs. A few simply stared, frozen by curiosity and fear. The air was thick with unease. Daniel leaned in again, his voice firm. "Sir, you need to wake up." He shook the man harder this time. For a second, he thought he saw the man's chest rise, but there was still no movement of the eyes or mouth. He seemed lost in a deep, unnatural sleep. Daniel's worry deepened. He checked the man's breathing more closely and noticed it was faint, almost invisible. His training told him that this wasn't normal rest. This was something else. Behind him, Rex gave one last loud bark, as if urging Daniel to act faster. The officer felt the pressure of dozens of eyes on him. People were waiting to see what would happen next. He glanced at Rex, who looked back at him with steady eyes full of urgency. Daniel knew then that he had to trust his partner completely. Whatever was happening with this man, it wasn't ordinary. Rex had sensed it before anyone else. The crowd, the other officers, and even Daniel himself now depended on what the German Shepherd had discovered. And in that charged moment, with the noise of whispers rising and phones flashing, Daniel realized this was only the beginning of a story that none of them would forget. The sound of Rex's barking filled the entire bus terminal. No matter how much Officer Daniel tried to calm him, the German Shepherd refused to stop. His deep voice echoed across the hall, bouncing off the walls and drawing more and more attention. People who had been hurrying to catch their buses paused in their steps. Families held their children close. A vendor abandoned his stall for a moment just to see what the commotion was about. The scene had quickly changed from a busy, ordinary morning into something that felt tense and unusual. Daniel stood firmly by the bench where the passenger was still slumped. He gave Rex a short command, the kind that usually made him sit quietly. But Rex only growled and strained against the leash, eyes fixed on the bag under the man's head. His tail was stiff, his ears pinned forward, and every line of his body shouted that something was wrong. Daniel had worked with this dog for years, and he had never seen him so insistent. The officer's doubt slowly shifted into worry. He realized that Rex wasn't just being noisy, he was warning them. Another officer, a younger man named Lewis, stepped closer and whispered, "What's going on? Why won't the dog stop?" His eyes flicked nervously between the sleeping man and the restless German Shepherd. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know yet, but Rex doesn't do this for no reason. He smells something we can't see." Lewis swallowed hard. Could it be explosives? Or drugs? Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't want to frighten the people who were standing only a few feet away, whispering among themselves. Some of them had already taken out their phones, recording the scene. If it turned out to be serious, the video would spread everywhere in minutes. He had to handle this carefully. Daniel crouched again beside the man and gave him another shake. This time he pressed harder on the man's shoulder. "Sir, wake up. Do you hear me?" His voice was louder, more urgent. Still, the passenger remained motionless, his head tilting slightly, but his eyes closed tight. Lewis leaned in as well, frowning. "That's not normal sleep. Look at him. His breathing is so slow." Daniel noticed it too. Each rise and fall of the man's chest was faint, like it took great effort for him to draw air. The sweat on his forehead glistened under the light. His lips looked pale, almost bluish. It was enough to make Daniel's stomach tighten. This wasn't a simple nap. Something was wrong inside the man's body. Rex barked again, pawing at the floor as if he wanted to drag Daniel closer to the bag. His nose pressed toward it, nostrils flaring. Daniel reached out carefully, his fingers brushing the side of the black fabric. He felt a strange stiffness inside, like the bag was packed too tightly. He exchanged a look with Lewis, who raised his eyebrows in concern. "Call medical," Daniel said quietly but firmly, "and keep people back. We don't know what we're dealing with." Lewis nodded quickly and waved to another officer who hurried to radio for paramedics. Meanwhile, 2 other security staff began pushing the crowd a little farther back. Some passengers protested, wanting to see what was happening, but most obeyed once they saw the serious expressions on the officers' faces. Mothers pulled their children behind them. A man in a business suit muttered angrily about being late, but still stepped away. The nervous whispers grew louder as fear spread through the crowd. Daniel focused again on the passenger. He shook the man once more, harder than before. Finally, the man's eyelids fluttered just slightly, but there was no real response. His body stayed limp. Rex gave a short, sharp bark, almost as if urging Daniel not to waste time. "Something's very wrong," Daniel muttered under his breath. He tried to unzip the bag, but the zipper barely moved at first. It seemed jammed or stuck, Rex growled low in his throat, his body trembling with alertness. The sound made the people watching grow even more uneasy. A woman gasped. Someone else whispered, "What if it's a bomb?" That word spread quickly among the crowd, causing several people to gasp and step back farther. Daniel raised his hand calmly. "Stay back, everyone. Please remain calm. We are handling it." His voice was firm but steady, meant to keep the panic from rising too high. Inside, though, his own heart was pounding. Finally, with a sharp tug, the zipper opened a few inches. Daniel caught a faint chemical odor, sharp and unpleasant. He frowned, his mind racing. Drugs, maybe, or something else. He didn't pull the bag fully open yet. He wanted the medical team here first. If this man was carrying illegal substances, he might also be in danger himself. By now, 2 paramedics had rushed in with their equipment. They knelt beside Daniel, immediately checking the man's pulse and breathing. One of them shook his head. "It's weak, very weak. He needs help right now." Daniel moved aside to let them work, but Rex stayed close, barking again when the paramedics touched the bag. Daniel gave him a quiet signal to hold back. He trusted his partner, but he also knew the medical staff needed space. The paramedics laid the man carefully on the bench, checking his airway and preparing an oxygen mask. The crowd gasped again when the man didn't react at all. To many of them, it looked like he was already gone. Some people turned away, not wanting to see more. Others clutched their phones, filming every moment. Lewis leaned close to Daniel again. "This is serious. Rex probably smelled whatever he took." Daniel nodded grimly. He might be overdosing. Or worse. The tension in the room was unbearable. The German Shepherd paced, restless, never taking his eyes off the man in his bag. Every time someone came too close, he growled softly, his instincts screaming that the danger wasn't over. Daniel stood with his arms crossed, watching both the paramedics and his dog. His mind was full of questions. Why was this man traveling alone? What was in that bag that made Rex so desperate? And most of all, would the man survive long enough to answer any of those questions? The sound of the oxygen mask hissed softly as the paramedics worked. They gave each other quick instructions in low voices. One of them injected something into the man's arm, trying to bring him back. For a long moment, nothing happened. The man's chest barely moved, his face pale and sweaty. Then slowly, his breathing seemed to strengthen just slightly. A faint murmur escaped his lips. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Some people even clapped softly in relief, but Rex didn't relax. He stood stiffly, nose pointed at the bag as if saying, "This isn't over yet." And Daniel knew in his heart that his dog was right. The paramedics worked quickly, adjusting the oxygen mask on the man's face, while Officer Daniel kept one eye on them and the other on Rex. The German Shepherd stood stiff and alert, every muscle tense, his sharp eyes never leaving the small black bag. Even though the man's breathing had grown a little stronger, Rex's behavior made it clear that something inside that bag wasn't right. Daniel knew it. The dog had been trained for years, and this was more than instinct, this was certainty. Around them, the bus terminal was no longer just a place of movement and noise. It had turned into a stage where everyone's attention was locked on one scene. Travelers who had once been rushing now stood frozen, whispering nervously. Some recorded from a distance, their phones held high. Others whispered guesses. It must be drugs, maybe explosives, or maybe he's sick. The air was thick with suspense, like the moment before a storm breaks. One of the paramedics turned to Daniel, his face tight with worry. "He's stabilizing a little, but he's not out of danger. Did you check his belongings?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Not fully. Rex is focused on the bag. There's something inside. I got a smell when I tried to open it, chemical, sharp. Could be drugs." The paramedic frowned. That would explain his condition. If he ingested or carried something dangerous, it could be harming him. Daniel knew they couldn't wait much longer. He had to see what Rex had been barking about. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the zipper again. Rex leaned forward, his nose twitching, body braced like a spring. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as Daniel slowly pulled the zipper open. At first, only darkness showed inside. Then a dull, plastic-wrapped bundle came into view. Daniel carefully pulled it halfway out. The bundle was tightly sealed, layers of tape wound around it, and the same sharp chemical smell filled the air again. Rex barked once, loud and certain, the sound making people jump. "It's contraband," Daniel said firmly, showing the package to the other officers. "Narcotics, most likely." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A man muttered, "I knew it," while a woman clutched her chest in shock. The other officers quickly moved closer, taking the bag and its contents as evidence. Lewis held it carefully, his gloves shielding him while Daniel zipped the bag shut again to keep the smell from spreading further. But just as they stepped back, something unexpected happened. The once limp passenger jerked awake with a sudden violent movement. His eyes shot open wide, glassy and wild, and his hands twitched as if trying to grab something. The crowd screamed, the sound piercing through the terminal. Some people stumbled backward, knocking into each other, while others raised their phones higher, trying to capture the chaos. Rex lunged forward with a fierce growl, but Daniel held him back with a sharp command. He needed control, not panic. The man's sudden movement had shocked everyone, but it quickly became clear that he wasn't in control of himself. His eyes rolled, his body shaking. The paramedics restrained him gently, holding his arms while they adjusted the oxygen mask again. "He's in serious distress," one of them said, his voice urgent. "He needs to get to the hospital immediately." The stretcher was brought forward. As they lifted the man, some of the tightly wrapped packages inside the bag shifted, making a soft thud on the floor. The crowd gasped again. It was clear now. He had been carrying more than one bundle, and the weight of his secret was heavy. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just about drugs. If this man had been traveling with multiple packages, it meant there was a larger operation behind it. But in that moment, his main concern was life, the fragile line the passenger was walking on. Rex, however, seemed to care about both life and truth. The dog barked again, pulling toward the bag, reminding Daniel that justice was also at stake. The man was secured onto the stretcher, his body still trembling slightly but his breathing steadier under the mask. The paramedics wheeled him toward the waiting ambulance, their faces tight with urgency. The crowd parted quickly, creating a path, though not without more whispers and fearful glances. Parents covered their children's eyes. Travelers clutched their luggage closer. It was a sight they would not forget soon. Daniel followed the stretcher until they reached the ambulance doors. Rex walked at his side, growling softly at the smell still clinging to the air. Before the doors closed, Daniel looked at the man's pale face, his eyes half open but unfocused. For a brief second, he wondered about the story behind this passenger. Who was he? Why had he chosen this path? And was this near-death moment enough to change him? But those were questions for later. Right now, the terminal was buzzing with fear, relief, and shock all at once. The other officers began gathering the bag and its packages for testing. Lewis shook his head in disbelief. If Rex hadn't noticed, he might have died sitting right there, and we would never have known what he was carrying. Daniel glanced down at his partner. Rex stood proudly, tail stiff, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The officer felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just about uncovering hidden drugs, it was about saving a life too. His loyal companion had done both in one morning. The crowd's whispers grew louder again. Some people clapped softly, their relief showing. Others shook their heads, shocked at how close they had been to danger without realizing it. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and said, "The dog's a hero." The mother smiled weakly and nodded, her eyes still wide from the scene she had witnessed. Daniel raised his voice once more, addressing the crowd. "Everyone, thank you for your patience. The situation is under control. Please continue with your travel plans. And remember, sometimes things are not always as they seem. Stay alert, stay safe." Slowly, the terminal began to move again. People returned to their benches, vendors reopened their stalls, and announcements about departing buses filled the air once more. But the atmosphere was different now. Everyone carried the memory of what they had just seen. The barking dog, the unresponsive passenger, the shocking discovery. Daniel walked Rex back to the security office where the evidence was being logged. He gave his partner a firm pat on the head. "You did good, boy," he whispered. Rex wagged his tail slightly, finally relaxing now that the worst of the danger was past. For Daniel, though, the weight of the discovery remained. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something bigger, something that would soon unfold beyond the walls of the terminal, and deep inside he knew that Rex would be there, ready whenever the next call came. The sound of the ambulance siren faded into the distance, but the echoes of what had just happened still hung heavy in the bus terminal. People were still talking about it in hushed voices, their faces pale from the shock. Some were relieved that the man had been taken away safely, while others couldn't stop glancing nervously at the spot where he had been lying. The bench looked ordinary again, but everyone knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Officer Daniel stood in the middle of it all, Rex by his side. His loyal partner seemed calmer now, though his sharp eyes still followed the officers who were carefully bagging the seized packages. Daniel bent down and rubbed Rex's head, his voice soft. "You did it, boy. You saved a life and uncovered the truth." Rex wagged his tail slowly, as if he understood the weight of his actions. The packages were placed onto a table in the security office at the terminal. Each one was tightly sealed, heavy, and carried that same bitter chemical smell. A specialist team had been called to examine them. The officers wore gloves and spoke in low voices as they tested the contents. The crowd had mostly returned to their routines, but the atmosphere was far from normal. Travelers walked with more caution, parents held children a little closer, and even the vendors spoke more quietly than before. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed near Rex, watching everything unfold. His thoughts were divided. On one hand, he felt proud. Rex's sharp senses had saved a man who might have otherwise slipped away quietly on that bench. On the other, the discovery of those packages troubled him deeply. He knew this wasn't just one man carrying something for himself. It was bigger. It was connected to something beyond the terminal, something that Rex had unknowingly dragged into the light. Lewis returned after helping the paramedics load the passenger into the ambulance. He looked both relieved and shaken. "He's alive, but barely," he reported. "They're taking him to the hospital. They said if it had been even half an hour later, he might not have survived." Daniel nodded, letting out a slow breath. Rex knew before anyone else. He kept barking because he understood the danger. Lewis glanced at the dog and smiled faintly. "He's more than a dog. He's a guardian." The words were simple, but they carried truth. Rex wasn't just an officer's partner. He was a protector, a lifeline between danger and safety. Daniel gave his companion another pat, his chest swelling with pride. Just then, a specialist officer called Daniel over to the table where the packages lay. "Take a look at this," the man said, pointing to the wrapped bundles. "It's narcotics. No doubt about it. And not just a small amount. This is a significant haul. Whoever this man is, he wasn't just carrying it for himself. He was moving it for someone bigger." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So this isn't the end." "It's the start of an investigation." The officer nodded. "Exactly. We'll trace where this came from and who it was meant for. But one thing is certain. Your dog just prevented a large shipment from being delivered." Daniel looked at Rex with fresh admiration. The German shepherd sat calmly by his side, tail curled around his paws, watching the scene with steady eyes. He looked almost unaware of the praise he was earning, content just to be near his partner. Daniel leaned closer and whispered, "You don't even know how many lives you just saved, do you?" While the officers worked, more people began to approach Daniel and Rex. Some wanted to shake Daniel's hand. Others simply wanted to thank Rex. Children reached out timidly to pat the dog's fur, their fear replaced with wonder. One little boy said loudly, "That dog is a hero." His words made the nearby crowd smile, easing some of the tension that had been hanging in the air. Daniel let Rex soak in the attention, though he kept him close. He knew the dog deserved it. Without him, the man might have died quietly, and the dangerous packages would have gone unnoticed. Instead, a life had been saved and a crime had been stopped. Outside, reporters had already gathered. News of the event had spread quickly, carried by passengers who had filmed the entire scene. Cameras flashed and journalists shouted questions as Daniel stepped out with Rex. "Officer, how did the dog know?" One reporter asked. Another called out, "What was in the bag? Is it true it was drugs?" Daniel kept his answers calm and professional. Rex is trained to detect substances and unusual behavior. Today, his instincts were correct. He alerted us to danger, and because of that, a man's life was saved and illegal items were recovered. The reporters scribbled notes quickly, snapping more pictures of Rex, who stood tall and dignified beside his partner. The dog didn't understand the cameras or the attention, but his calm posture only made him look more heroic in the eyes of those watching. Inside the terminal, life slowly returned to normal, but the story of what had happened spread like wildfire. Passengers told each other, "I saw it with my own eyes." The dog wouldn't stop barking, and then they found those packages. The story grew in each retelling, and by the time evening arrived, Everyone in the city seemed to know about the heroic police dog who had saved the day. Later that night, Daniel sat in his office, Rex lying at his feet, resting after the long day. Papers were scattered across the desk, reports, evidence lists, and statements from witnesses. But Daniel's mind wasn't on the paperwork. He was thinking about the moment Rex had first barked. At the time, it had seemed like an annoyance, maybe even a mistake. Now he realized that bark had been the first step in saving not only the man's life, but also protecting countless others from harm. He looked down at Rex, who was sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. A small smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "You did well, partner," he whispered softly. "You were the voice none of us could hear." For Daniel, the day had been long and heavy, but it carried a lesson he would never forget. Trust. Trust in instincts, trust in partnership, and trust in the silent warnings that sometimes only a loyal companion can give. The world might have seen just a barking dog, but Daniel knew the truth. Rex had been speaking louder than words ever could, and as the city outside buzzed with the news of the heroic dog, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The investigation into the drugs would continue, questions would be asked, and answers would slowly appear. But no matter how large the case became, one truth would remain the same. It all started with a single bark that refused to be ignored. The next day, the story of what happened at the bus terminal was everywhere. Newspapers carried bold headlines about the heroic police dog who had saved both a man and the public. News channels replayed the shaky phone videos again and again. The image of Rex barking furiously at the sleeping passenger had become a symbol of loyalty and instinct. On social media, people shared the clips with words like bravery, guardian, and true hero. The once ordinary German Shepherd had turned into a name known across the city. Officer Daniel didn't chase fame, but he couldn't deny he felt proud as he watched the world react to his partner's actions. He sat at his desk that morning, a cup of coffee cooling beside his untouched papers. Rex lay near his feet, stretched out on the floor looking relaxed and unaware of his rising fame. For Rex, it had only been another day of duty. For Daniel, it was proof again that the bond between officer and dog was more powerful than most people could ever imagine. The man who had been taken away in the ambulance was still alive. The hospital had confirmed he had been dangerously close to losing his life, but thanks to quick medical attention, he had survived. Doctors explained that the man had overdosed on what he was carrying. His body couldn't handle it anymore, and he had nearly slipped away while sitting quietly on that bench. Without Rex's warning, he might have gone unnoticed until it was too late. Daniel thought often about that. The man wasn't just a criminal. He was a human being who had been saved in time. The law would deal with his actions, but he had been given another chance to live. Daniel wondered what choices he would make now. Would he change? Would he finally realize the danger he had put himself and others in? Only time would tell. Later that week, Daniel and Rex were invited to a small ceremony at the city hall. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was heartfelt. People gathered, clapping as Rex entered the room wearing his polished collar and leash. Children held little posters that said, "Thank you, Rex." Reporters snapped photos, and the mayor himself bent down to pat the German Shepherd gently on the head. "This dog reminded us all of something important," the mayor said in his speech. "That sometimes the smallest signals, the things we overlook, can be the difference between life and death. Rex reminded us to pay attention, to trust, and to value the silent guardians among us." Daniel stood proudly beside his partner, smiling as Rex wagged his tail politely at the applause. He gave a short speech too, his voice steady. Rex did what he was trained to do, but more than that, he acted out of instinct and loyalty. He refused to stay silent when something was wrong. Because of that, a man is alive today, and many dangerous packages were kept off our streets. I am honored to stand beside him. The crowd clapped again, their cheers echoing through the hall. For a brief moment, Daniel felt the weight of the entire city's gratitude, but even as he accepted the praise, he knew Rex wasn't in it for glory. The dog's joy came from simple things: his partner's touch, the trust they shared, and the quiet satisfaction of doing his job. After the ceremony, people continued to approach them. Parents asked for photos of their children with Rex. Journalists requested interviews. Even elderly travelers who had been in the terminal that day came forward to share their thanks. One woman, her voice trembling, said, If not for your dog, my grandchildren and I might have been sitting right beside that man. Who knows what could have happened? Thank you. Daniel nodded, his eyes softening. All thanks to Rex. He was the one who saw what none of us could. That night, when the excitement of the day had faded, Daniel returned home with Rex. He removed the uniform from his shoulders, unbuckled Rex's leash, and let him wander freely around the house. The German shepherd stretched, curled up near the couch, and drifted into a peaceful sleep. Daniel sat quietly for a while, watching him. The house was silent, but inside his heart there was noise, a mixture of pride, relief, and deep reflection. He thought about the chain of events. A man on a bench, a bag, a bark that refused to stop. So simple at first glance, yet it had changed so much. A life had been saved, a crime uncovered, and a city reminded of the silent heroes that walked among them. Daniel realized something else, too. Rex had not just reacted to the smell of chemicals. He had sensed the urgency of life itself, the danger that hung in the air. That was something training alone couldn't explain. It was something deeper, something almost spiritual. The following week, the investigation confirmed what Daniel had suspected. The man had been part of a larger operation. The packages he carried were linked to a dangerous network. By stopping him, Rex had helped uncover a bigger crime that stretched far beyond the terminal. More arrests were expected. The case was ongoing, but the ripple effect of one dog's bark had already reached far corners of the city. For Daniel, the lesson was clear. Never underestimate the power of trust, even if it comes from a creature who cannot speak human words. Rex had spoken louder than any person in that terminal, and his message had been clear. Pay attention. Something is wrong. In the weeks that followed, people continued to stop Daniel on the street. They would smile, wave, and sometimes bend down to greet Rex. The dog accepted it all calmly, never changing, never letting the attention distract him from his real duty. He remained the same loyal partner, the same watchful guardian. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Daniel walked Rex through the park. Children ran past, playing games, their laughter filling the air. A man on a bench waved, recognizing them from the news. Daniel smiled back, but his thoughts were far away. He remembered the man on the terminal bench, pale and unresponsive, his life hanging by a thread. And he remembered Rex's barking, sharp and relentless, refusing to be ignored. Daniel stopped walking for a moment and looked at Rex, who turned his head up at him, ears perked, waiting for the next command. Daniel bent down, placing a hand gently on his companion's neck. His voice was low, filled with gratitude. You're not just my partner, Rex, you're a reminder. A reminder that life can change in a second, that paying attention can save everything, and that sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms or badges. They just bark when it matters most. Rex wagged his tail, licking Daniel's hand once before trotting forward again, ready for whatever lay ahead. The officer straightened, his chest filled with quiet pride. The city might forget tomorrow's headlines, but he would never forget the sound of that bark. It had been more than noise. It had been a warning, a call to action, and in the end, it had been the sound that saved lives. And so the story ended not with flashing lights or loud applause, but with a simple truth. A police dog had done his duty faithfully and bravely. He had changed lives by refusing to stay silent. And for Officer Daniel, that was the greatest victory of all.